The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, thick with grief and anger. Ethan Cade stood at the edge of the circular council chamber, his hands clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles gleamed white under the cold, artificial light. The air smelled faintly of ozone, a byproduct of the holographic displays flickering in the center of the room. Each projection showed the faces of children, some laughing, some staring shyly at the camera, some mid-sentence as if frozen in time. 800,000 faces, 800,000 futures stolen. A voice broke the silence, brittle and trembling. How did it happen? Counselor Varen's words felt like they were drawn from a well of disbelief. His lined face, usually hardened with age and experience, now bore the raw vulnerability of a man broken. How could they? His voice cracked, and he stopped, unable to finish the question. They didn't just do it, Ethan said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. He stepped forward, his boots clicking against the polished floor. They planned it, calculated it. 800,000 children weren't collateral damage. They were the target. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Someone at the far end of the table muttered a curse, low and venomous. Ethan's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of each council member, daring them to look away. No one did. They called it an experiment, Ethan continued, his voice steady despite the fury bubbling beneath. The Galactic Empire wanted to see how we'd break, how Earth would crumble when they tore out its heart. They thought we'd kneel. His voice dropped. Each word weighted like a hammer striking an anvil. They were wrong. From the corner of his vision, Ethan noticed a young woman shift uncomfortably. Lyra Hallen, one of the youngest analysts in the room, held a tablet close to her chest, her wide eyes darting between the council members. She had been the one to uncover the transmission detailing the massacre, a chilling message from the Empire's command, casually describing the genocide as a necessary measure. Ethan gestured toward her. Lyra, share the transmission. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she activated the tablet. The holographic display in the room's center shifted, now showing a crisp, coldly clinical voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Experiment 731. Completed. Targets neutralized. Observational data indicates the species exhibits heightened emotional response to juvenile loss. Expected societal destabilization within 2 cycles. Proceed with Phase 2. The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, acrid and choking. Counselor Varen slammed his fist onto the table, the sharp sound breaking the trance. Monsters, he spat. Monsters who think they've won, Ethan said, his tone softer but no less cutting. He turned his back to the council, pacing toward the holograms of the children. Their faces seemed to watch him, their eyes filled with a trust he couldn't repay. They expect us to crumble, to retreat into our broken world and let them reign unchallenged. But that's not what we do, not humanity. What are you suggesting, Cade? Another counselor asked, skepticism lacing her tone. We're outmatched in every way. Their fleet alone. I'm not suggesting a fleet, Ethan interrupted, his voice gaining an edge. I'm suggesting Project Phoenix. The room stilled again, the name unfamiliar to some but not to all. Counselor Varen leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Phoenix? That's a myth. No, Ethan said, his voice firm. It's a plan. Years in the making. We've always known the Empire wouldn't stop until they controlled every corner of the galaxy. So we prepared. He turned back to the room, his presence commanding. Phoenix isn't about fleets or armies. It's about infiltration, subterfuge. We embed ourselves within their systems, their structures. We dismantle them piece by piece from the inside. So when we strike, they won't see it coming. A murmur spread through the council chamber, uncertainty mixed with intrigue. Lyra raised her hand slightly, her voice hesitant but clear. Do we have the resources to pull this off? The people? Ethan nodded, his gaze softening slightly as he addressed her. We do. People who've already risked everything to fight back in smaller ways. Engineers, hackers, diplomats. People who can live unnoticed within the Empire's shadow and turn it into their downfall. Decades, another counselor muttered. It could take decades. And? Ethan asked, his tone defiant. The Empire spent centuries building their dominance. We can spend a few decades tearing it down. What other choice do we have? The silence that followed wasn't the same suffocating grief from before. It was sharper, charged with the weight of decision. Counselor Varen finally nodded. What do you need? Ethan exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Authority to assemble a team. Full access to resources, no red tape. And your patience. This won't be fast and it won't be clean, but it will work. Varen nodded again, and slowly the others followed. Lyra hesitated before speaking, her voice steady despite the quaver Ethan could see in her hands. You'll need someone to manage intelligence. I'll volunteer. Ethan raised an eyebrow. This isn't safe, Hallen. It wasn't safe for those children either, she replied, her eyes hardening. I'm in. Ethan studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. Welcome to Phoenix. Later that evening, Ethan stood alone on the observation deck of the Council's orbital station. The Earth hung below him, a fragile sphere of blue and green that seemed so impossibly small. Stars glittered around it, distant and cold. He sipped from a steaming mug of something bitter, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill of the station's air. The sound of footsteps echoed softly, and he turned to see Lyra approach, her tablet tucked under one arm. Sir, she said, hesitating as if unsure of her place in the quiet moment. Call me Ethan, he said, turning back to the viewport. What's on your mind? She paused, her expression conflicted. I wanted to say that I believe in this, in you. But I'm scared. If we fail, we won't, Ethan interrupted, though his tone wasn't dismissive. He looked at her, his expression both tired and resolute. Fear isn't weakness, Lyra. It's fuel. You let it remind you what's at stake, but you don't let it control you. Lyra nodded, though her shoulders still carried the weight of uncertainty. Thank you, she said quietly, before turning to leave. Ethan turned back to the stars, his grip tightening on the mug. In the reflection of the glass, the faint holographic projections of the children appeared again, their faces flickering like distant memories. He raised the mug slightly, a silent toast. For the ones we lost, he murmured, and the ones who will never know loss again. Ethan Cade stared at the endless black of space beyond the observation deck, the stars a cold reminder of how vast and indifferent the galaxy could be. Earth was visible below, a fragile jewel amidst the void, its beauty belied by the scars the Empire had inflicted. He could almost feel the weight of those 800,000 lives pressing against the glass. He had made the toast, whispered the vow. Now came the harder part, keeping it. A faint chime broke the stillness. He turned to see Lyra Hallen standing just inside the doorway, clutching her tablet like a lifeline. She had traded her civilian attire for a sleek, tactical jumpsuit, but the determination in her eyes was the real transformation. They're ready for you, she said softly. Ethan nodded, brushing past her. The hum of the station's systems grew louder as they moved through its sterile corridors, the air tinged with the faint, metallic scent of recycled oxygen. His boots echoed off the walls, steady and deliberate. Lyra followed in silence, her own steps lighter, but no less purposeful. They entered a conference room where 4 individuals sat waiting, their expressions ranging from cautious to curious. The tension in the air was palpable, a taut thread waiting to snap. Ethan scanned the room, noting the subtle details that spoke volumes. A hand twitching toward a concealed weapon, a barely perceptible frown, a steady gaze that hinted at defiance. He stopped at the head of the table and folded his arms, letting the silence stretch. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but charged. I won't sugarcoat this. If you're here, it's because you're good at what you do, and because you've already lost too much to sit on the sidelines. But this mission isn't about revenge. It's about precision, subtlety, survival. If you're looking for glory, leave now. No one moved. A faint smirk tugged at Ethan's lips. Good. Let's get to it. He turned to Lyra, who stepped forward and activated her tablet. The holographic projector in the center of the table flared to life, displaying a detailed schematic of the Galactic Empire's core territories. Ethan gestured toward the projection, his voice sharpening. The Empire's strength isn't just in their fleet or their weapons, it's in their control. Trade routes, communications, resource distribution, all of it flows through this network. He pointed to a nexus of glowing lines. Project Phoenix will dismantle that control, piece by piece. The man sitting closest to Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. His dark eyes glinted with skepticism. "And you think the 5 of us are enough to pull this off?" Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "I don't need an army, Joran. I need the best, and that's what you are. Unless you're about to tell me otherwise." Joran Vex tilted his head, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I wouldn't dream of it." Ethan allowed himself a brief nod before continuing. "Each of you has a role. Joran, your job is infiltration. You'll get us access to the Empire's most secure installations without leaving a trace." Joran's smirk widened. "Breaking and entering? Finally, something I'm good at." Ethan ignored the quip and gestured to the woman sitting beside Joran. Her sharp features and tightly braided hair gave her a no-nonsense air. "Commander Sarah Vane, logistics and strategy. You'll coordinate our movements and ensure our supply chains stay hidden." Sarah gave a curt nod. "Understood." Ethan's gaze shifted to the youngest member of the group, a wiry man with nervous energy radiating from him. "Corin Sol, technology. You'll handle communication, surveillance, and anything else with a circuit." Corin swallowed hard, but managed a quick nod. "Got it." Finally, Ethan turned to the last member, a grizzled man with scars that seemed to tell 1,000 stories. "And Drake Wren, combat operations. When subtlety isn't enough, you'll make sure we still get out alive." Drake grunted in acknowledgement, his sharp blue eyes sizing Ethan up. Ethan straightened, his gaze sweeping over the group. "You've all lost something to the Empire. Families, homes, futures. But this isn't about getting even. It's about making sure no one else has to lose what we have. We're going to break the Empire, not with fleets or armies, but with whispers and shadows. If you're not ready for that, now's your chance to walk away." Silence filled the room. Then Joran chuckled softly. "Well, when you put it like that, how could we say no?" Ethan's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. "Good. Welcome to Phoenix." The first mission came sooner than anyone expected. The briefing room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Lyra stood at the projector, highlighting the schematics of a small Imperial communications hub on the outskirts of a major trade route. "This hub coordinates the flow of resources to 3 nearby systems," she explained. "If we disrupt it, we'll cripple their supply chain in this sector for weeks." "And draw a lot of attention," Sarah added, her voice measured. "Exactly," Ethan said, "which is why this has to be clean. No bodies, no traces." Joran whistled low. "You're really taking all the fun out of this, Cade." Drake shot him a withering look. "You'll live." The insertion was executed under the cover of night, the team's shuttle gliding silently through the atmosphere. Ethan sat in the cockpit beside Sarah, his eyes fixed on the horizon as the hub came into view, a squat, utilitarian structure bristling with antennae and surrounded by a faintly glowing energy shield. "Everyone ready?" Ethan asked over the comm. "Locked and loaded," Drake replied, his voice a steady rumble. "In position," Joran added, his tone casual but focused. The shuttle landed in a clearing just beyond the shield's perimeter. The team disembarked swiftly, their movements precise and silent. The scent of damp earth mingled with the faint hum of the shield, and the cool night air carried a hint of ozone. Joran led the way, his fingers dancing over a small device as he hacked into the shield's control panel. "Piece of cake," he muttered as the shield flickered and vanished. The team slipped inside, their steps muffled by the soft hum of the hub's machinery. The interior was dimly lit, the walls lined with blinking consoles and glowing screens. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air, sharp and sterile. Corin knelt by a console, his fingers moving rapidly over the controls. "I'm in," he whispered. "Disabling comms now." Ethan kept watch, his senses attuned to every sound. A faint vibration underfoot signaled the approach of a patrol drone. He gestured sharply, and the team melted into the shadows. The drone passed by, its searchlights sweeping the corridor. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. "Clear," Drake muttered, stepping out of the shadows. The mission continued smoothly, each member executing their role with precision. As they exited the hub, Ethan allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. "One down," he said softly. 1,000 to go." Joran smirked. "What's life without a little ambition?" Ethan didn't reply. He was already thinking about the next step. The sharp chill of recycled air filled the nondescript conference room aboard the Empire's orbital station. Ethan Cade adjusted his collar, the crisp fabric of his stolen uniform brushing against his neck like a quiet reminder of how close the edge was. The holographic briefing flickered before him, its dull blue glow casting shadows across his face. Imperial officers milled around, their voices a mixture of clipped professionalism and unguarded arrogance, oblivious to the infiltrator among them. Ethan's fingers tightened around the datapad in his hand as he memorized the station's layout. The operation ahead was delicate, its success hanging by a thread no thicker than the lies he had fed to earn this position. A voice broke through his concentration. "Lieutenant Corvin!" someone barked, using the alias he had adopted. Ethan looked up to see Commander Zerath, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "Yes, Commander?" Ethan replied, his tone even. "You're with me," she said, motioning for him to follow. The authority in her voice allowed no room for hesitation. He fell into step behind her, his senses heightened. The corridors of the station were a labyrinth of stark white walls and polished steel, their harsh lights reflecting off every surface. The faint hum of the station's power core thrummed beneath their feet, a constant reminder of the Empire's reach. "You've reviewed the schematics?" Talden asked, glancing at him sideways. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said smoothly. "Every detail." "Good. You'll oversee the encryption update on Deck 7 and make it quick. Command expects a full diagnostic report within the hour." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. Deck 7 housed one of the station's primary data cores, a gold mine of Imperial intelligence if he could breach its systems. But the clock was ticking, and the slightest mistake could blow his cover. As they reached the lift, Talden stepped inside and turned to face him. "The Empire doesn't tolerate inefficiency, Lieutenant. Fail here, and you'll learn that firsthand." Ethan gave her a curt nod, masking the cold dread creeping into his chest. "Understood, Commander." The lift doors slid shut, and as the hum of its ascent filled the silence, Ethan felt the weight of the mission press harder. This wasn't just about sabotage, it was about survival. Elsewhere on the station, Corin's soul crouched in a cramped maintenance crawl space, his hands deftly wiring a relay module into the station's communications array. The confined space smelled of burnt circuitry and machine oil, the faint tang clinging to his tongue as he worked. "Hurry up, Corin," Joran's voice crackled over the comm in his ear. "We're running out of time." "I'm going as fast as I can," Corin hissed, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "You think splicing Imperial encryption is easy? Be my guest." "Just don't mess it up," Joran replied. Corin muttered under his breath and focused on the task. Every second spent here felt like a gamble, but if the relay worked, they would have access to the Empire's internal communications, a priceless advantage. The sound of approaching footsteps froze him. He held his breath, the faint thud of boots on metal grating growing louder. His pulse pounded in his ears as the footsteps paused just outside the crawlspace hatch. "Maintenance report shows activity here," a voice said. Corin's heart threatened to hammer out of his chest. Slowly he reached for the small knife strapped to his thigh, his fingers trembling. "Must be another glitch in the system," another voice replied. "We'll check it later." The footsteps receded and Corin exhaled shakily. He quickly finished wiring the relay and activated it. The faint hum of success brought a small, shaky grin to his face. "I'm done," he whispered into the comm. "Good," Joran replied. "Now get out of there before someone decides to check twice." On Deck 7, Ethan stood before the imposing console of the data core, its surface glowing faintly with rows of symbols and graphs. His reflection stared back at him from the sleek metal, his features obscured by the dim light. "Diagnostic starting now," he announced to the empty room, his voice echoing faintly. He slid the stolen keycard into the console, the device whirring to life. Streams of Imperial data cascaded across the screen, and Ethan's fingers flew over the controls. His movements were precise, each keystroke calculated to leave no trace of his tampering. The air in the room felt heavy, the faint scent of ionized particles clinging to his senses. Sweat prickled at the nape of his neck as he inserted the second device, a covert decryption module provided by Corin. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his eyes flicking to the door. The screen blinked twice, and the module's light turned green. Ethan allowed himself a moment of relief. The data was his. He quickly extracted the module and wiped the console's memory, leaving no evidence of his intrusion. But as he turned to leave, the door hissed open, and Commander Talden stepped inside. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Lieutenant," she said, her gaze sharp. "You're still here?" "Just finishing up the diagnostic, ma'am," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. The silence was suffocating, each second stretching into eternity. "Very well," she said finally. "Report to the bridge when you're done." Ethan nodded, his chest tight as she left the room. He exhaled slowly, his muscles unclenching. That had been too close. Back on the shuttle, the team gathered in tense silence. The faint hum of the engines filled the small space, mingling with the acrid smell of burnt electronics. Ethan placed the decryption module on the table, its surface gleaming under the dim overhead light. "That was risky," Sarah said, her arms crossed. "Too risky." "It worked," Ethan replied, his tone firm. "For now," she shot back. Corin leaned forward, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. "What did we get?" Ethan activated the module, and a cascade of files lit up the holographic display. Imperial schematics, troop movements, and encrypted transmissions scrolled past, their significance dawning on the team. "This," Ethan said, his voice low, "is how we win." But as the files continued to load, a single entry caught his eye, an encrypted message marked Priority 1. He selected it, and a cold chill ran down his spine as the words appeared. "Suspected infiltration within key sectors. Initiate countermeasures immediately." Ethan's jaw tightened. The Empire was onto them. "This changes everything," he murmured, his mind already racing. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice heavy with tension. Ethan straightened, his gaze hardening. "We adapt. The mission continues. But now we move faster. And smarter." The team exchanged wary glances, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Ethan looked out the shuttle's viewport, the distant stars a silent witness to the battle ahead. "Phoenix doesn't burn out," he said quietly. "It rises." The shuttle's faint hum vibrated beneath Ethan Cade's boots as he paced the cramped cabin. The weight of the Priority 1 message lingered in the air like an unseen predator, its implications gnawing at his thoughts. Outside, the void of space stretched endlessly, the stars indifferent to the danger closing in. Sarah Vane broke the tense silence, her voice low but firm. "They're onto us, Ethan. We can't keep working like this. We need to change the game before they outmaneuver us." Ethan stopped pacing and turned toward the team. The dim cabin lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, highlighting the tension etched into each line and crease. "We don't stop," he said, his tone resolute. "If they know we're here, it means we're close to something big. We just need to find it before they find us." Corin Sol fidgeted in his seat, his fingers drumming against his datapad. "And how exactly do we do that? Their countermeasures won't be half-baked. We're walking into a trap if we're not careful." Ethan's gaze softened, though his determination didn't waver. "Corin, you're right. They'll expect us to retreat, regroup, maybe even scatter. That's exactly why we won't." He leaned over the holographic display table and activated the decrypted files they had stolen. The familiar cascade of Imperial data lit up the cabin, bathing the team in a pale, flickering light. Ethan's fingers moved deftly across the interface, isolating key pieces of information. "Here," he said, highlighting a dense cluster of coded transmissions. "The Empire's primary research facility, Zerath Prime. It's where they're developing new technology and strategies. And more importantly, it's where they're storing classified intel about their leadership structure." Joran Vex leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes narrowing. "So, let me get this straight. You want us to waltz into the Empire's brain trust, poke around, and then waltz out like it's just another day?" "That was risky," Sarah said, her arms crossed. "Too risky." "It worked," Ethan replied, his tone firm. "For now," she shot back. Corin leaned forward, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. "What did we get?" Ethan activated the module, and a cascade of files lit up the holographic display. Imperial schematics, troop movements, and encrypted transmissions scrolled past, their significance dawning on the team. "This," Ethan said, his voice low, "is how we win." But as the files continued to load, a single entry caught his eye, an encrypted message marked Priority 1. He selected it, and a cold chill ran down his spine as the words appeared. "Suspected infiltration within key sectors. Initiate countermeasures immediately." Ethan's jaw tightened. The Empire was onto them. "This changes everything," he murmured, his mind already racing. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice heavy with tension. Ethan straightened, his gaze hardening. "We adapt. The mission continues. But now we move faster. And smarter." The team exchanged wary glances, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Ethan looked out the shuttle's viewport, the distant stars a silent witness to the battle ahead. "Phoenix doesn't burn out," he said quietly. "It rises." The shuttle's faint hum vibrated beneath Ethan Cade's boots as he paced the cramped cabin. The weight of the Priority 1 message lingered in the air like an unseen predator, its implications gnawing at his thoughts. Outside, the void of space stretched endlessly, the stars indifferent to the danger closing in. Sarah Vane broke the tense silence, her voice low but firm. "They're onto us, Ethan. We can't keep working like this. We need to change the game before they outmaneuver us." Ethan stopped pacing and turned toward the team. The dim cabin lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, highlighting the tension etched into each line and crease. "We don't stop," he said, his tone resolute. "If they know we're here, it means we're close to something big. We just need to find it before they find us." Corin Saul fidgeted in his seat, his fingers drumming against his datapad. "And how exactly do we do that? Their countermeasures won't be half-baked. We're walking into a trap if we're not careful." Ethan's gaze softened, though his determination didn't waver. "Corin, you're right. They'll expect us to retreat, regroup, maybe even scatter. That's exactly why we won't." He leaned over the holographic display table and activated the decrypted files they had stolen. The familiar cascade of Imperial data lit up the cabin, bathing the team in a pale, flickering light. Ethan's fingers moved deftly across the interface, isolating key pieces of information. "Here," he said, highlighting a dense cluster of coded transmissions. "The Empire's primary research facility, Zerath Prime. It's where they're developing new technology and strategies. And more importantly, it's where they're storing classified intel about their leadership structure." Joran Vex leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes narrowing. "So, let me get this straight. You want us to waltz into the Empire's brain trust, poke around, and then waltz out like it's just another day?" "Not waltz," Ethan corrected, his tone sharp. "Infiltrate, steal, sabotage." Sarah's expression remained stoic, but her voice carried a note of skepticism. "Zerath Prime will be heavily guarded. We need a plan that doesn't rely on luck or miracles." Ethan nodded. "Agreed. Here's how we do it." He expanded the schematic of Zerath Prime, its sprawling structure a maze of interconnected corridors, labs, and hangars. He began outlining the operation, his voice steady but urgent. "Corin, you'll access their external systems remotely, creating a false trail to divert their patrols. Make it look like an external threat is targeting their outer perimeters. That should draw their forces away from the interior." Corin nodded, his earlier apprehension replaced by focused determination. "Consider it done. Sarah," Ethan continued, "you'll coordinate our timing and logistics. Once we're inside, we'll have a narrow window to extract the intel and disable key systems without tripping their fail-safes." Sarah's lips tightened into a thin line, but she nodded. "I'll make sure everything's synchronized." "Drake," Ethan said, turning to the grizzled soldier, "you and I will handle the physical infiltration. Once we're inside, I'll access their archives while you secure the extraction point." Drake grunted his acknowledgement, his scarred hands flexing as if preparing for the inevitable fight. "And Joran," Ethan finished, his gaze locking onto the infiltrator, "you'll get us in. Their security is tight, but I trust you can find a way." Joran smirked, his confidence bordering on cockiness. "Oh, I'll find a way. Just make sure you keep up." The tension in the room shifted, a fragile resolve forming as the team absorbed the plan. Ethan straightened, his gaze sweeping across the group. "This isn't just another mission. Zerath Prime holds the answers we need, the tools to take down the Empire from the inside. But we have to be precise. One mistake, and we're all dead." A heavy silence followed his words, broken only by the soft hum of the shuttle. Then Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the weight of the moment. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Let's get to work." The approach to Zerath Prime was cloaked in a shroud of subterfuge. The research facility orbited a barren, storm-racked planet, its sleek design a stark contrast to the chaotic storms below. Massive energy pylons crackled with power, illuminating the void with brief flashes of light. Inside the shuttle, Corin's fingers flew across his console, his screen a blur of numbers and signals. "Disabling their outer sensors. Now," he muttered, his voice tense but steady. The shuttle slipped through the perimeter undetected, its engines whispering against the void. Joran guided the craft toward a docking port on the facility's underside, his hand steady on the controls. "Docking in 5, he said, his tone calm. "Get ready." The moment the shuttle latched onto the facility, Ethan and Drake moved. The airlock hissed open, revealing a dimly lit corridor lined with steel and faintly glowing conduits. The air was cold and sterile, carrying a faint metallic tang. Joran worked quickly, his tools producing faint clicks and whirs as he bypassed the docking security. "You're clear," he said, stepping aside. Ethan and Drake slipped into the corridor, their movements swift and silent. The faint hum of the facility's systems reverberated through the walls, a reminder of the Empire's omnipresent control. Sarah's voice crackled over their comms. "You're in? Proceed to the archive wing. Corin's diversion has them focused on the outer sectors, but don't linger." The pair moved through the labyrinthine halls, their footsteps muffled by the sleek flooring. The occasional hiss of steam or flicker of a malfunctioning light added to the oppressive atmosphere. At the archive wing, Ethan halted, his eyes scanning the room. Rows of data terminals stretched before them, each one glowing faintly with the Empire's secrets. "This is it," Ethan said, moving to the nearest terminal. His hands flew over the controls, his eyes narrowing as he navigated the encrypted files. Drake stood guard, his weapon drawn and his gaze sharp. "Make it quick. We're sitting ducks here." Ethan didn't reply, his focus unyielding. Streams of data scrolled past, revealing troop movements, research logs, and classified operations. But one file stopped him cold. "Operation Omega, Priority Directive." His fingers hovered over the terminal for a fraction of a second before selecting the file. The screen filled with detailed schematics of a new weapon, one capable of annihilating entire planets. This changes everything," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible. Drake glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "We have what we need. Let's move." As they began their retreat, the facility's alarms blared to life, a shrill sound that cut through the air like a knife. "Corin!" Ethan barked into the comm. "What happened?" "I don't know," Corin's panicked voice replied. "Something tripped their internal sensors. You've got company heading your way." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We're on our way out. Joran, prep the shuttle for immediate departure." The corridors erupted into chaos as Imperial patrols swarmed the facility, their boots thundering against the floors. Ethan and Drake moved with precision, their every step calculated. Blaster fire lit up the halls, the acrid scent of burning circuits filling the air. Drake returned fire, his shots precise and lethal, while Ethan pushed forward with the stolen intel clutched tightly. They reached the shuttle just as Joran fired its engines, the craft shaking with the force of its launch. The team collapsed into their seats, their breaths heavy. As the facility shrank in the distance, Ethan held up the stolen file, his expression grim. "This isn't just about dismantling the Empire," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation. "It's about stopping what they're planning next." The shuttle's interior was thick with tension, every breath heavy as if weighed down by the enormity of what they had uncovered. The stolen file glowed faintly on the holographic display, its lines of schematics and directives casting eerie reflections on the team's faces. Operation Omega was more than a weapon. It was a death sentence for any world that dared oppose the Empire. Ethan Cade stood at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his fingers curled into fists. The air was saturated with the scent of burnt circuitry and sweat from their frantic escape. He stared at the projection, his mind working furiously to parse the implications. "They're building a planetary annihilation weapon," he said, his voice low but resonant. "And from these specs, they're close to operational. If they finish this, there won't be any rebellions to spark. They'll wipe us all out before we can even act." Drake leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression grim. "So we stop them. Same as always." "This isn't the same," Kieran Saul interjected, his voice tinged with frustration. He tapped on his datapad, expanding the schematics. "The weapon's core is shielded by layers of adaptive defenses. Even if we breach their facility, we'd need a coordinated strike to disable the core, and that's assuming we even get close enough." Sarah Vane, seated at the far end of the table, leaned forward, her sharp gaze cutting through the gloom. "Then we don't think about proximity. We think about strategy. We don't just strike the facility. We dismantle the infrastructure supporting it." Ethan's eyes narrowed, and he nodded slowly. "We don't take out the weapon directly. We take out the foundations it's built on. Supply chains, data relays, energy conduits, anything that makes it functional. If we cripple those, the weapon becomes useless." "And how do we do that without tipping them off?" Joran Vex asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "They already suspect we're in play. Another move like Zerath Prime, and they'll be on us before we get anywhere near their core systems." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line as he studied the projection. His mind sifted through possibilities, each one branching into a web of contingencies. Finally, he looked up, his voice steady but commanding. "We use their overconfidence against them. The Empire thrives on control, but they're overextending. We hit 3 targets simultaneously, spread them thin, overwhelm their resources. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late." The plan took shape over the next hour, a mosaic of strategy and precision. Sarah coordinated the logistics, her voice calm but firm as she assigned each team member their role. Kieran analyzed the weapon's dependencies, mapping out critical nodes that could be targeted without compromising the larger mission. Ethan focused on timing, ensuring each strike would synchronize seamlessly. He moved around the table, his presence magnetic, his voice carrying the quiet intensity of a man who had shouldered too much loss to accept failure. The first target was a supply depot orbiting a resource-rich asteroid belt. It was a hub for raw materials essential to the weapon's construction, and its destruction would send ripples through the Empire's logistics network. Ethan and Joran infiltrated the depot under the guise of Imperial contractors, their stolen credentials granting them access past the outer checkpoints. The facility was a sprawling complex of steel and glass, its towering silos humming with the energy of constant activity. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of machinery and coolant. Workers bustled about, their faces shadowed by fatigue and the harsh glow of industrial lights. Ethan adjusted his uniform, the fabric stiff against his skin, and kept his movements deliberate. "We need to reach the central control room," he murmured to Joran, his voice barely audible over the din. Joran smirked, his eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. "Relax, Cade. I've got this." He slipped away, his movements so casual they bordered on disarming. Ethan watched as Joran approached a terminal, his fingers dancing over the controls. Seconds later, the lights flickered, and a faint alarm blared. "What's going on?" a worker shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "System malfunction," Joran replied smoothly, his tone calm and authoritative. "Evacuate the area while we run diagnostics." The workers hesitated, then began to filter out. Ethan joined Joran at the terminal, his eyes narrowing as the controls unlocked. "Show off," Ethan muttered. "Part of my charm," Joran shot back. Together, they uploaded a virus into the depot's systems, one designed to overload its energy grid. As the facility's machinery groaned under the strain, Ethan and Joran slipped out, their footsteps muffled against the polished floors. The explosion that followed lit up the asteroid belt, a brilliant cascade of fire and debris that left the depot a smoldering ruin. The second target was a communications relay buried deep within a dense nebula. Sarah led this mission, her tactical mind navigating the team through the nebula's chaotic energy fields. The relay itself was a towering structure of black metal, its spires piercing through the nebula's swirling gases like jagged teeth. The faint hum of energy resonated through the air, a low vibration that seemed to settle in their bones. "We don't have long," Sarah said, her voice clipped. "This field won't mask us forever." Corin worked furiously at the relay's control panel, his fingers moving with a precision born of desperation. "Almost there," he muttered, sweat beading on his brow. Sarah kept watch, her sharp eyes scanning the dense mist for signs of Imperial patrols. Her hand rested on her weapon, the cool metal a steadying presence. When the relay's systems began to flicker, Sarah gave a sharp nod. "Move out. Now." The team retreated just as the relay erupted into a cascade of sparks and smoke, its communications network severed. The final target was an energy conduit hidden beneath the surface of a barren moon. Drake led the charge, his commanding presence galvanizing the team as they navigated the moon's treacherous terrain. The conduit was embedded within a labyrinth of tunnels, its location guarded by layers of automated defenses. The air was thick with the acrid stench of oil and metal, the faint hum of machinery echoing through the dark corridors. Drake moved with precision, his footsteps deliberate, his weapon at the ready. Ethan followed close behind, his mind racing as he calculated their next move. "Defense grid ahead," Drake said, his voice low. Ethan nodded, his gaze narrowing. "Disable it, quietly." Drake smirked. "I don't do quiet, but I'll try." He approached the grid, his movements fluid despite his size. With a few deft motions, he severed the power source, the grid sputtering and dying. Ethan and Drake reached the conduit's control room, its walls lined with glowing panels and cables. Together, they planted charges along the core, the faint scent of explosives mingling with the sterile air. As they retreated, the charges detonated, the explosion sending a tremor through the moon's surface. Back aboard the shuttle, the team regrouped, their faces etched with exhaustion but tinged with satisfaction. The Empire's infrastructure was crumbling, its weapon no closer to completion. Ethan leaned against the wall, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. He looked around at his team, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady. "The weapon isn't finished yet, but neither are we." Sarah met his gaze, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Then let's make sure they never finish it." Ethan nodded, the weight of the mission settling on his shoulders once more. The path ahead was treacherous, but they had taken the first steps toward dismantling the Empire's reign. The shuttle's engines purred softly as it cut through the vast emptiness of space, its hull glinting faintly under the light of a distant sun. Inside, the air was thick with a potent mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The team huddled around the central display table, its holographic projection casting shifting blue light over their faces. The glow highlighted the lines of weariness etched into their features, but also the determination that burned beneath. Ethan Cade leaned forward, resting his palms on the table's edge. His gaze was fixed on the schematics of the Empire's central command hub, the nerve center of their operation. The data they had stolen and the precision strikes they had executed had brought them here, on the brink of disrupting the Empire's hold once and for all. "This is our moment," Ethan began, his voice steady but charged with urgency. "Everything we've done has led to this. If we succeed, we cripple the Empire's ability to function at a galactic level. If we fail—" He let the weight of his words hang in the air. Drake Wren, ever the stoic, broke the silence. "We won't fail," he said, his gravelly tone as firm as his posture. He was standing near the shuttle's entrance, checking his weapon with methodical precision. The click of the rifle's chamber snapping shut punctuated his resolve. Kieran Saul cleared his throat, his nervous energy palpable as he tapped on his datapad. The problem isn't just getting in, it's staying in long enough to finish the job. Their internal security protocols are designed to isolate breaches within seconds. "That's where you come in," Ethan said, turning his attention to Kieran. "You'll create a cascade loop in their network, redirecting their response systems toward phantom threats. It won't buy us much time, but it'll keep them chasing shadows while we work." Kieran nodded, though his fingers fidgeted against the edge of his device. "No pressure, right?" "None at all," Joran Vex quipped from the corner, where he was lounging against the wall. His trademark smirk softened the tension in the room. "As long as you don't fry their system too early and leave us stranded." Sarah Vane cut through the banter with a pointed look. "Focus, all of you. We're walking into the most secure location in the Empire. A single mistake isn't an option." Ethan nodded, appreciating her no-nonsense tone. "Sarah's right. Here's how we'll execute this." He expanded the holographic map to show the hub's interior, a labyrinth of corridors, control rooms, and data terminals. The facility was encased in a protective shell of high-density alloy, accessible only through a reinforced docking bay. "Joran, you'll handle the entry point. Their external defenses are designed to counter fleets, not individuals. Once we're in, Kieran will deploy his Cascade program to disrupt their internal systems." He gestured to the central control room, its location marked with a glowing red dot. "Sarah, you'll oversee coordination from the command relay. Drake and I will plant the charges on their power grid while downloading the core intel." "And when the alarms go off?" Joran asked, raising an eyebrow. "We adapt," Ethan replied, his tone firm. "That's why I chose this team. We're not just following orders, we're making this mission our own." The plan was set. As the team dispersed to prepare, the tension in the shuttle shifted from anxious to focused. Each member moved with purpose, their actions precise, as they double-checked equipment and synchronized their movements. The faint scent of oil and metal lingered in the air, mingling with the hum of the engines. The hub loomed ahead, a massive structure suspended in the void. Its surface gleamed like obsidian under the faint starlight, broken only by the intermittent flashes of patrol lights sweeping its exterior. Ethan stood at the shuttle's viewport, his gaze unflinching as he took in the formidable sight. "Final checks," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Everyone ready?" A chorus of affirmations followed, each voice steady despite the underlying tension. Joran guided the shuttle toward a blind spot in the hub's perimeter, its engines muffled by Kieran's stealth dampeners. The docking maneuver was seamless, the soft thud of the shuttle locking into place signaling the start of the operation. The docking bay was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hiss of air as the team disembarked. The cold metal of the hub's floor sent a shiver up Ethan's spine, its sterility a stark reminder of the Empire's efficiency. Joran moved to the access panel, his tools clicking softly as he worked to override the security lock. The air was thick with tension, each second stretching like an eternity. Finally, the door slid open with a faint hiss, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. "After you," Joran said, his smirk returning briefly before vanishing into focused resolve. The team moved with practiced precision, their footsteps muffled against the smooth floor. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant, its walls lined with glowing conduits that pulsed with energy. Kieran lagged slightly behind, his fingers flying over his datapad as he activated the Cascade program. "Loop's live," he whispered. "They're seeing ghosts now." The faint flicker of lights and a low hum from the conduits signaled the program's success. Ethan nodded and motioned for the team to press on. The central control room, was a stark contrast to the sterile corridors, a sprawling space filled with rows of terminals and holographic displays. The air buzzed with energy, the scent of heated electronics filling their nostrils. Ethan and Drake moved quickly, planting charges along the power conduits while Sarah monitored their progress from the relay. "Corin, status?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the urgency. "Everything's holding," Corin replied, though his tone betrayed his tension. "But they'll catch on soon." As Ethan inserted the data extraction module into the core terminal, the room's lighting shifted to an ominous red. The faint blare of alarms echoed through the hub, signaling the inevitable. "They're onto us," Sarah's voice crackled over the comm. "You need to move now." Ethan's fingers flew over the terminal's interface, his eyes narrowing as streams of classified data began downloading. The faint hum of the system grew louder, almost drowning out the sound of approaching boots. Drake moved to the doorway, his weapon raised as Imperial guards rounded the corner. The ensuing firefight lit up the room, the sharp crack of energy rounds filling the air. The acrid scent of burning circuits mingled with the metallic tang of blood as Drake held the line. "We're almost done!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The final files downloaded, and Ethan ripped the module from the terminal. "Charges set! Let's go!" The team fell back toward the docking bay, the hallways erupting into chaos as more guards flooded the area. Joran covered their retreat with precise shots, his movements fluid and calculated. Corin scrambled to keep the cascade program active, his breaths ragged with exertion. As the shuttle doors closed behind them, the team collapsed into their seats, their chests heaving. The soft rumble of the engines signaled their escape as the hub detonated behind them, a cascade of fire and light consuming the structure. Ethan leaned back, his fingers clutching the data module. His gaze shifted to the viewport, where the stars seemed closer now, their light a quiet promise. "This was just the beginning," he murmured. "Now we take it all." The silence aboard the shuttle was deafening. The team sat scattered across the cabin, their expressions marked by a combination of exhaustion and focus. The faint hum of the engines provided the only background noise, a steady reminder that there was no turning back. Ethan Cade stood by the central console, the stolen data module clasped tightly in his hand, its weight far heavier than its size implied. "This is it," Ethan began, his voice low but resonant. "The data confirms the weapon's final assembly is taking place on Corin Spire, the Empire's central stronghold. If we don't stop it now, they'll finish it, and we lose everything." The holographic map of Corin Spire flickered to life above the console, its towering structure stretching toward the simulated heavens. The fortress sat atop a volcanic world, its surface a roiling sea of molten rock and relentless heat. The air in the room grew heavy as the team studied the projection, the enormity of the task pressing down on them. Sarah Vane leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she examined the schematics. The Spire's defenses are layered, anti-air turrets, patrol squads, and a shield network that can withstand direct bombardment. It's a fortress in every sense of the word. "And yet," Joran Vex interjected, his tone sharp with resolve, "fortresses fall. They always do. You just need the right tools." "Or the right distraction," Ethan said, his gaze sweeping over the team. "We're not taking this head on. We'll divide their attention, exploit their blind spots, and hit them where it hurts the most." Corin Saul frowned, his fingers hovering over his data pad. "You're talking about coordinated strikes on multiple fronts. If one piece of this fails—" "It won't fail," Ethan cut in, his voice steady but firm. "Because every piece is critical. Here's the plan." The hologram shifted, zooming in on the Spire's primary systems. Ethan pointed to the power grid that ran through the fortress like veins in a body. "Corin, you'll infiltrate their mainframe and shut down the shield network. Without it, their defenses are exposed." Corin nodded, though his grip on the datapad tightened. "I'll need time, more than usual. Their encryption is layered. I can crack it, but it won't be fast." "You'll have it," Ethan assured him, then turned to Joran. "You and Sarah will handle the external defenses. Create a diversion near the western docking bay. Draw their attention away from the core." Joran grinned, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. I've always loved a good fireworks show. Sarah remained composed, though her sharp nod conveyed her readiness. Drake, Ethan said, his voice taking on a heavier tone as he turned to the seasoned soldier. You're with me. We'll breach the Spire's central chamber and plant charges on the weapon's power core. If everything goes right, it'll never leave the ground. Drake's scarred face broke into a faint smirk. Sounds like my kind of job. The shuttle descended through the turbulent atmosphere of Corin Spire, its hull rattling under the pressure. The volcanic world below pulsed with an ominous red glow, its rivers of molten rock carving paths through the cracked surface. The air smelled of sulfur and scorched earth, a reminder of the relentless heat rising from the planet's core. As the team prepared to disembark, Ethan addressed them one last time. Stay sharp, stick to the plan, and no matter what, we finish this. The hatch opened with a hiss, and the team moved swiftly, their boots crunching against the charred ground. The Spire loomed ahead, its jagged silhouette cutting through the thick haze like a blade. The faint hum of the shield network vibrated in the air, a constant reminder of the fortress's impenetrable defenses. Corin broke off first, his smaller frame disappearing into the shadows as he headed for the control center. Sarah and Joran moved next, their movements synchronized as they approached the western docking bay. Ethan and Drake remained behind, their eyes fixed on the Spire's central entrance. Let's move, Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of volcanic eruptions. The pair approached the entrance, their every step deliberate. The faint scent of burning metal mingled with the acrid tang of sulfur, and the oppressive heat pressed against their skin despite their insulated suits. Drake took point, his weapon at the ready, as Ethan worked to bypass the security lock on the reinforced door. Inside, the Spire was a maze of steel corridors and glowing conduits, the walls vibrating faintly with the hum of power flowing through them. The air was cooler but carried a sterile, mechanical scent that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Corin, status?" Ethan whispered into his comm. "I'm in position," Corin replied, his voice strained but focused. "Give me 5 minutes and the shields will drop." "Make it 3, Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The minutes stretched like hours as Ethan and Drake navigated deeper into the Spire. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, each reverberation sending a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. When the shields finally flickered and died, a faint cheer crackled over the comm. "Shields are down," Corin announced, "but they're already working to restore them. You don't have much time." "Understood," Ethan replied. "Sarah, Joran, proceed with the diversion." The faint rumble of explosions followed moments later, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The Spire's internal alarms blared, their shrill tones cutting through the air like a blade. "We've got their attention," Sarah reported. "You're clear to move." Ethan and Drake pressed forward, their every sense heightened. The central chamber loomed ahead, its massive doors sealed tight. Drake placed a charge on the locking mechanism, the faint scent of explosives mingling with the metallic tang of the air. The explosion was sharp and brief, the doors groaning open to reveal the chamber beyond. The weapon's power core dominated the space, a pulsating mass of energy encased in layers of reinforced glass. The air was thick with heat and the faint hum of raw power, a palpable reminder of the destruction it could unleash. Ethan moved quickly, planting charges along the core's support systems while Drake kept watch. The faint clatter of approaching boots sent a jolt through them both. "They're here," Drake muttered, his weapon snapping into position. "Hold them off," Ethan replied, his focus unyielding. "Just a few more seconds." The firefight that erupted was deafening, the sharp crack of energy weapons mingling with the acrid scent of burning metal. Drake moved with precision, his every shot calculated, but the sheer number of guards threatened to overwhelm them. "Ethan, now!" Drake barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Ethan activated the final charge and turned to his partner. "Fall back!" The pair retreated under a hail of fire, their breaths ragged as they made their way toward the extraction point. The charges detonated moments later, the resulting shockwave shaking the entire Spire. As the shuttle's engines roared to life, the team collapsed into their seats, their bodies battered but their mission complete. Ethan looked out the viewport, as the Spire crumbled in the distance, its weapon reduced to a memory. "We're not done," he said, his voice heavy with resolve. "But we've just changed the game." The Spire's collapse lit up the volcanic skyline, a cascade of fiery debris raining down into the molten rivers below. On board the shuttle, the silence was thick, not with fear or hesitation, but with the weight of what had just been accomplished. The faint hum of the engines and the occasional hiss of stabilizers created a rhythm almost hypnotic in its steadiness, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. Ethan Cade stood by the viewport, his reflection flickering over the distant fires of Corin Spire's destruction. Behind him, the team sat scattered in the dimly lit cabin, their exhaustion visible in every line of their bodies. Drake was cleaning his weapon with mechanical precision, the familiar ritual grounding him. Joran was leaning back in his seat, a smirk tugging at his lips despite the bruise blooming across his cheek. Corin was hunched over his datapad, fingers trembling slightly as they worked through the remains of the Empire's fractured systems. Sarah sat apart, her sharp eyes scanning the team, her presence a silent reassurance that they had made it. Ethan turned to face them, his voice breaking the stillness. "We've done more than cripple their weapon," he said, his tone steady but laced with an undertone of gravity. "We've sent a message. The Empire is, As the shuttle's engines roared to life, the team collapsed into their seats, their bodies battered but their mission complete. Ethan looked out the viewport as the Spire crumbled in the distance, its weapon reduced to a memory. "We're not done," he said, his voice heavy with resolve. "But we've just changed the game." The Spire's collapse lit up the volcanic skyline, a cascade of fiery debris raining down into the molten rivers below. On board the shuttle, the silence was thick, not with fear or hesitation, but with the weight of what had just been accomplished. The faint hum of the engines and the occasional hiss of stabilizers created a rhythm almost hypnotic in its steadiness, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. Ethan Cade stood by the viewport, his reflection flickering over the distant fires of Corin Spire's destruction. Behind him, the team sat scattered in the dimly lit cabin, their exhaustion visible in every line of their bodies. Drake was cleaning his weapon with mechanical precision, the familiar ritual grounding him. Joran was leaning back in his seat, a smirk tugging at his lips despite the bruise blooming across his cheek. Corin was hunched over his datapad, fingers trembling slightly as they worked through the remains of the Empire's fractured systems. Sarah sat apart, her sharp eyes scanning the team, her presence a silent reassurance that they had made it. Ethan turned to face them, his voice breaking the stillness. "We've done more than cripple their weapon," he said, his tone steady but laced with an undertone of gravity. "We've sent a message. The Empire isn't untouchable." Drake looked up, his blue eyes piercing through the dim light. "A message won't stop them from retaliating. What's the plan for when they come looking?" Ethan held his gaze, unflinching. "They'll come," he admitted. "But when they do, they'll find we're not waiting for them. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about winning." Joran let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You're bold, Cade, I'll give you that." Before Ethan could reply, Corin straightened suddenly, his eyes wide as they locked onto the datapad in his hands. "You need to see this," he said, his voice trembling slightly. He swiped his fingers across the screen, casting the holographic display into the center of the room. The projection showed intercepted communications from the Empire's command network, fragments of hastily encrypted transmissions. The words that emerged were chilling. "Backup protocols initiated. Tactical subversion imminent. Contain at all costs." "They're regrouping faster than we thought," Sarah said, her tone sharp but measured. "We forced their hand, but that also means they're desperate." "Desperate makes them dangerous," Drake muttered, his hand tightening around his weapon. Ethan studied the display, his mind working through the implications. The Empire's speed was impressive, but desperation left cracks they could exploit. "We've shattered their control," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Now we need to finish what we started. We hit their leadership directly." Sarah raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "You're suggesting we take the fight to their core systems? Their central command?" "Yes," Ethan replied, his gaze unwavering. The Spire was their weapon, but their leadership is their heart. If we dismantle that, the entire empire collapses. Corin hesitated, his voice quieter but insistent. That's a death sentence if we don't plan it perfectly. That's why we plan, Ethan said, and why we stick together. The shuttle's engines roared as they set course for their next destination, the Empire's central command station, a massive orbital structure known as Imperium Nexus. Its name alone carried the weight of authority and fear, but for the team, it was a symbol of the final barrier between oppression and freedom. The Imperium Nexus came into view hours later, its massive form silhouetted against the distant glow of a binary star system. It was a fortress in every sense of the word, its gleaming towers and sprawling wings connected by an intricate web of energy bridges. Patrol ships circled it like vultures, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. Inside the shuttle, Ethan gathered the team one last time. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and metal, the confined space amplifying the weight of the moment. He looked at each of them in turn, his voice calm but firm. This is our last move. The Nexus isn't just their command center, it's their symbol. If we take it, we don't just win the battle. We change the war. Drake grunted, his lips curving into a faint smile. Sounds like a hell of a gamble. It's not a gamble, Sarah interjected, her voice carrying the steel of conviction. It's a calculated risk, and it's the only way to end this. Ethan nodded, grateful for her support. We infiltrate through the lower docks. Joran, you'll secure our entry point. Corin, you'll shut down their defensive grid. Sarah, you'll coordinate the strikes. Drake and I will head for the command center. The plan was set, but the weight of it hung over them like a storm cloud. Joran broke the tension with a low whistle. Just another day, right? The team shared a quiet laugh, the sound tinged with something bittersweet. It wasn't just another day, it was the day. The infiltration was smoother than expected, their forged credentials and Corin's hacked access codes granting them passage into the Nexus. The lower docks were a hive of activity, the air filled with the faint scent of fuel and ozone. Workers moved in synchronized chaos, oblivious to the team's presence as they slipped deeper into the structure. Once inside, the tension ratcheted up. The sterile corridors were a labyrinth of metal and light, the faint hum of energy conduits vibrating through the walls. Every step felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. Corin worked quickly, his fingers a blur as he disabled the defensive grid. Done, he whispered, his voice tight with focus. But they'll notice soon. Ethan and Drake moved toward the command center, their movements precise and deliberate. The air grew heavier as they approached, the faint sound of voices echoing from the chamber ahead. Inside, the command center was a stark contrast to the cold corridors, a sprawling room filled with holographic displays and towering consoles. The Empire's highest-ranking officers stood in tense clusters, their voices sharp and commanding. Ethan signaled to Drake, who positioned himself at the entrance, his weapon trained on the room. Ethan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chatter. Your time is over. The officers turned, their shock quickly morphing into rage. Who are you? One of them demanded. The beginning of your end, Ethan replied, his tone cold and unyielding. The firefight that erupted was brutal and chaotic, the sharp crack of energy rounds reverberating through the room. Drake moved like a force of nature, his precision and strength unmatched. Ethan focused on the consoles, planting charges that would obliterate the Nexus's control systems. When the last officer fell, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the charges counting down. Ethan turned to Drake, his chest heaving. Time to go. They retreated to the shuttle as the Nexus began to crumble, its towers collapsing in on themselves. The team watched from the viewport, the sight both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Ethan turned to his team, his voice steady despite the weight of their victory. We've shown them that humanity doesn't break. We rise. The stars beyond the collapsing Nexus seemed brighter, a quiet promise of the freedom they had fought for. And as the shuttle soared into the vast unknown, humanity's story began again, unbroken and unbowed.